I loved Eric Hobsbawm, even when I disagreed with him, which was often. The last time I saw him was at a memorial service for Victor Kiernan. One after the other, the communist historian group was dying off. And at the end of the day, I asked Eric Hobsbawm if he wanted to join us for dinner. He came to dinner, but then he said I have to leave very urgently. Remember, he was born in 1917, and this must have been in 2010. And he said I have to leave urgently because tomorrow I'm flying to the Arab world. I asked him, what are you doing in the Arab? He said, I have a series of lectures. And he touched his, briefcase and said, I have to go home and prepare. One of the most extraordinary things about Eric Hobsbawm was the attention to detail. And, I'm glad you mentioned his telescopic sense of change, from the ration book to the passport. Unfortunately, we are at the age from Eric Hobsbawm to Ashish Nandi. It's a great demise of the idea of the public intellectual. Now public intellectuals can, without any research, say whatever they want and be gadflies and, pretend that they are riling you up in order to make you think. But the singular feature of Eric Hobsbawm, even when he spoke on a variety of issues, was his deep attention to detail, to empirical research, to verifying things, to being able to argue things based on material that he had in front of him. There are some people who don't speak without papers, and I think those are people to take extremely seriously. People who make a commitment to coming before other people, but having prepared. And that's something really to appreciate of that generation's public intellectual. And that's where Eric Hobsbawm was. So it could have been part of the legacy of British empiricism, the great sense of utilizing the data of the capitalist classes in the same way as Marx, for instance, utilized the Blue Book in the British Museum. It could be that heritage. It could also very well be the heritage of a certain kind of intellectual culture that I fear that we often seem to be losing. And that is the intellectual culture of debate across difference, but grounded in mutual respect and an adherence to, learning, to having studied things, not to dismiss study. Well, given that, I'm going to reflect on Eric Hobsbawm's work through a talk given by Madhavan Palat, who used to teach Russian history at Jawaharlal Nehru University and is now the editor of the new series of Jawaharlal Nehru's selected works. Madhavan, on the 22nd of November, gave a very interesting talk called The Interesting Ideas of Eric Hobsbawm. And he delivered this at the Murti, the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And in this talk, which was very wide-ranging and I think very appreciative of the role of Eric Hobsbawm, Madhavan made two basic points that I'm interested in. One, he raised the question asking whether Eric Hobsbawm was actually a Marxist. At one point, Madhavan says, mercifully, Eric had said that, all historians after the 19th century are Marxists of a sort. Although I can't really seem to understand how he would come to that conclusion given some of the stuff I read. But at any rate, he said mercifully because of that, Eric was more perhaps an Enlightenment, devotee rather than a Marxist. So that's one thing I'm interested in pursuing for a few minutes. Obviously, the real thing to pursue there is what is a Marxist historiography. But we don't have time to get into that. So I'll pursue a little bit in what way was Eric Hobsbawm a Marxist. And in the second question that Madhavan raises, which I think is a significant question, important question, a question that should not be avoided, is why did Eric Hobsbawm ignore America? Why was America this, a continent that didn't exist in much of his work? It didn't play a formative role. And it's interesting, I began by talking about the memorial to Victor Kiernan, who, in contradistinction, spent a great deal of time studying the role of America in the modern world, and in fact writing very interesting essays on the question of American imperialism. So these are the two broad themes that I want to lift out of Madhavan's talk, where I don't think he captures the essence of Eric Hobsbawm, at least in these two respects. So, was he a Marxist? Well, certainly he said he was one through his career. And anybody who lives that long cannot obviously be reduced to any one thing, as we've all suggested. It's very hard, even when you look at How to Change the World, a book with essays that do span 50 plus years. Eric Hobsbawm had a very, checkered engagement with different strands of Marxism. When he discovered the work of Gramsci, and when he discovered the Italian Communist Party, in some ways, that's where he found his home. He was more a member of the Italian Communist Party than the Communist Party of Great Britain, where he actually had his party card stamped. His affinities were more with the Italians. He preferred their mode of politics, mass politics, popular front politics. That's indeed how he had emerged. Looking at the rise of fascism in Europe, being of Jewish background, born in Alexandria, somebody utterly different whom the Nazis were congenitally predisposed to hate. Popular front politics appealed to him instinctively, and in many ways, as he says in his autobiography, his turn to communism was more because of his aversion of fascism than anything through his learning. That would follow. His was an instinctual move into the communist movement, then he develops it through an engagement with Marxism, and he found in the Italians a much more open-ended, popular front type of politics, which would both be the bit that energized Eric Hobsbawm's commitments and also, I think, led to his pessimism, because he took the turn with the Italians into Eurocommunism and therefore into the liquidation of the communist movement itself in Italy. And I think when he says that it's an idea whose failure was written in from the start, it's not communism that he's referring to alone, but it's the kind of commitments that he had made as a young man to a certain kind of popular front communism that had become, fell on its knees essentially through communist refoundation and other, remnants of the Italian experiment. So, of course he was a Marxist. He said so. He wrote about Marx. That at one level should be sufficient. We are a pluralist camp in terms of our engagement, and I suppose that's the first step. But he was also a Marxist in terms of his understanding of the historical sweep. Firstly, he was very interested in that great transition, the great debate over the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Certainly, that debate becomes excessively formalized in the mode of production debate. Eric didn't take a direct position in that, but certainly when he was one of the early people to introduce the sections from the Grundrisse, which was published as Pre-Capitalist Economic Formations, and when he wrote his very significant introduction to that extract from the Grundrisse, which also appears in his collection, there he brought forward his own opinion about that transition. That transition is fundamental to the Marxist imagination, because after all, politically, if you can't show that capitalism was not eternal, you cannot show that it can also be buried. In other words, it is not something that's transhistorical. It had its origin, and its origin in some ways should be specifically pointed toward. This is a big debate. Some people, I think, are very reductionist in this debate. They say, well, it's only if there's free labor. If there's no free labor, it's not capitalism. I find that to be a very reductionist position. There are varied positions in that debate. Eric did not himself take a position in that debate that was very firm, but certainly that horizon had to begin with the end of feudalism and the entry of capitalism. So that's one thing that I think was very important for his broad account. The second thing that's very important for his broad account was precisely what you mentioned about the question of industry. And when Industry and Empire comes out, when that torturous, you described the lectures, Hari, as torturous, that he was working through ideas of class with as it were, the sweep of English history. One thing that's important about Eric Hobsbawm is he didn't resort to cliches. He was interested in interrogating categories without being theoretical. He was not a theorist. Even when you read his theoretical essays, they're not theoretical as much as they're a historian trying to engage with method, a historian trying to engage with theoretical texts. But he himself wasn't disposed to write a theory of, say, a Marxist interpretation of history. His volume on history are also a series of episodic reflections on history writing. It's not a theory of history as such. At any rate, the question of industry was to him central. It's not just a matter of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. The question also is, what is the motor of that transition? And Eric here, being, I suppose you could call him an economic historian, although that is also not sufficient, saw the transition through the agglomeration of industry in the European North. And there, the question of the colonies was always present. In age of revolutions in 1962, he has that great line about it launched like a glider. Industry launched like a glider. And what propels it, of course, is that so-called primitive accumulation or originary accumulation that comes out of what he in that book called the undeveloped areas. He didn't have a very good sense of history outside Europe, although he constantly referred in these 4 volumes, but the 3 certainly, he constantly referred to experiences elsewhere. They were on his radar, but he didn't focus in on them. So certainly the originary accumulation issue, very important to the kind of motor that drives capitalism into a position of dominance. When capitalism comes to a position of dominance, the centrality of his studies of statistics was to demonstrate, the levels of immiseration, the creation of people who work but do not who are not enabled by the social wealth created by themselves. These are very conventional Marxist preoccupations. But here, Eric Hobsbawm, I think, adds something quite interesting, which is that he looked at, what is laboring and what is the potentiality of the laborers that are constituted. And here, the classic history from below narrative, which goes from, say, communist historians group all the way, to history from below in India, including subaltern studies, including, Jim Scott writing about, the Malaysia, the Southeast Asian highlands, etc. This vast sweep goes in one direction, which doesn't quite capture Eric Hobsbawm's own, I think, very creative input into the question of what happens to the people in the context of immiseration, of the emergence of capitalism. See, this vast sweep of history from below tends to a great sense of romanticism. That when the people resist, for instance, this is itself an act of celebration. When the people rise up, that is what one waits for. One waits for activity of spontaneous rising. That has been, I think, one of the great tendencies of the history from below school. Categories like spontaneity, popular rebellion, people's own cultural space, Partha Chatterjee's sense of the autonomous realm of the people vis-a-vis, the realm of capital. The people somehow detached from modernity, maybe, or at least the people able in their own struggles to have a transformational role in society. Eric Hobsbawm wasn't given over to romanticism. I think his category of pre-political here is very significant. He was trying to basically figure out what is resistance? Is resistance like the resistor in a circuit, where it's sometimes useful for a system to have resistors to remove excess energy from the system, where it's a dissipation of popular energy. Is there a way to canalize popular energy? I think his interest in organization is in that sense, but it's not just organization. The question of spontaneity is also provoked here. Do people rise simply because they rise? Do they rise because they are pushed so far that they can't take it any longer? Those are the expectations of rising. Or do people rise because there are ideological frameworks an organizational framework that enables them as well to find their voice in struggle and not in suicide. I think these questions raised by Eric are very important to return to, because I fear that a lot of history from below has become, enamored itself without considerations of the ideological and organizational forms in which people rise, which is different from celebrations of people rising. So in that sense, I think Eric was firmly placed within a Marxist narrative. Now, very quickly, I'm going to switch to the question of America. This guy loved jazz. He wrote avidly about jazz, but he didn't like America. In that sense, Madhavan is right. He is a European with a European's disdain for America. But Madhavan missed an important point, I think, which is that, yes, he couples the emergence of modernity with two revolutions. Those are the revolutions he talks about in the Age of Revolution. The French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. Let's say the English Industrial Revolution or the English Colonial Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. There's no real American Revolution. Occasionally, he mentions the American Revolution. In a sense, I think Eric didn't understand what the American Revolution was. It was for him seen too closely as a kind of adjutant of the Enlightenment, linked to what happened in France later. After all, the American Revolution happens in 1776, French Revolution in 1789. So the American Revolution predates the French Revolution, but he doesn't really deal with it. It's treated as if it's of the same kind as the French Revolution. But in fact, if you look at the American Revolution closely, the roots of US imperialism are rooted in that revolution itself. So if Eric had actually looked at it seriously, there would have been a trajectory in his Ages book which would have enriched the book. Why do I say it's rooted in itself? What was the American Revolution about? One of the very neglected aspects brought up by Victor Kiernan and by Garrett Stedman Jones in his earlier career, one very important aspect that's raised by them and by a host of American historians is that the colonialists wanted King George's reign to not any longer stop them from going beyond their 13 colonies. In other words, they did not want to be held to this side, the coastal section of the United States. They wanted to move into Native American lands. They wanted to move toward what would become war with France. War with the Native Americans as well. In other words, the American Revolution wasn't just about liberty. It wasn't just about pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness was to be through the expropriations of the lands that were, in a sense, west of the Mississippi all the way out to California. So Eric, not having actually grasped the significance of the American Revolution, was not able to put into his framework the emergence of US imperialism as a dominant force in world affairs, not just from 1925 onwards when it becomes the largest economy, but in fact, even during the First World War, when it begins to play a singularly important role in its colonies, when it emerges as a colonial power in the Philippines and in the Caribbean, but then of course with manifest consequences after 1945. So there, I think Madhavan makes a very important point, but doesn't get to why Eric missed out on locating the American Revolution as a central part in his large narrative. Well, I could go on for about 3 days, honestly. So many things to say. I mean, one of the things I'd like to end with is that not only did he not consider America, which is, in a sense, the bad side of history, American imperialism, the bad side of history in his broad narrative, but he also had a very, I think, maybe not a proper understanding of the role of the anti-colonial struggle. There's a point when I was rereading, I think the second volume maybe of the Ages trilogy, the first 3 books, where he writes the scrawn, this is in the Age of Revolution. He's writing about the Jacobins, and he says, the scrawny, stunted, undrilled soldiers of the French Revolution were capable of a physical endurance equal today only by the undersized gorillas in colonial mountains. There are these beautiful references to people fighting against colonialism. But that fight, or the platform that emerges out of that fight, was not available to him. So just when European civilization enters a position of subordination, he announces a moment of great pessimism. Had he looked further, perhaps he may have died a little less, not pessimistic, but a little less maybe unsure about the direction of the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think we have had a very